Okay, so what we've been thinking about on the blog for the last couple of weeks is this whole issue of constructivist approaches to education. Now, we know that as educators that what we're trying to do is we're trying to help our students develop their knowledge, their skills, and their understanding. And in a way, I think in the way in which we worked with those terms when we met, and thinking of understanding as being something which is sort of more deeper and more fundamental than mere knowledge and skills. It's a whole way of approaching the subject that we're um, trying to teach. It's a whole way of thinking about the subject which we're trying to teach. One of the things that we've been talking about is that as educators, what we're trying to do is we're trying to help our students construct or build up their own sense of meaning of whatever it is that we're teaching them. We'll all have some kind of mental construct of whatever it is that we're teaching. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to help our students build up their own. And this is a very different approach to teaching from the idea that you can transmit a body of knowledge. This is saying, well, no, actually, you can't transmit a whole mental schema to somebody. It's actually not possible. What you can do, and what in fact you need to do, is you need to help somebody build up their own. Now, next week, I'm going to be asking you to interview some students and get them to talk to you about what kind of meaning they've created of one of the modules that you've taught this year, both in terms of how they understood the module and how they understood the process of learning. This is a really important activity, and it can reveal sometimes it can reveal quite difficult things, actually, to be honest, because you might hear things that you are disappointed in or that you don't want to hear, or sometimes you hear things that are just frankly astonishing. And I talk to students and I think, my goodness, it would never have occurred to me that anyone could think of the module or the process of learning in this way. But it's always a hugely illuminating thing to do and a great thing to do towards the end of the year because it will really inform your planning for next year. Now, it's a tricky thing to do that. So I think the best way to work our way towards interviewing our students is to do to do a similar process ourselves. So what we're going to look at this week is have a think about what meaning you're making of your experience of the PG Cert, both in terms of um, as it were, the content of the PG Cert, the idea that we're trying to enable everyone to become a really expert teacher in their own way, and the process of working together on it. So it's really the subtitle that I'm interested in here, which is how are we all in different ways, and I think it will be different ways, I think it should be different ways, now making meaning of this whole field of learning and teaching which we've been engaging with. One way in which I thought we might begin to address this, now all you're going to get in these slides, really, in a way, is my attempt at answering that question. How do I understand the field of learning and teaching, and what is it that I think the PG Cert is trying to achieve? Doesn't mean to say it's necessarily achieving it, but it's like what I think it's trying to achieve. But that's just my answer to the question. There's nothing definitively right about this, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what everybody's different takes are on this question of what understanding are you making of learning and teaching. Now, one of the people who's working at the moment, Nud Illuris, who is Danish, he writes in English. I'm going to put a couple of his chapters up for you, and I will just say I always find something slightly odd about his prose. It's a little bit stiff and stilted for me. I think it's just an effect of somebody writing in what's clearly not their first language. Um, having having had some really cross responses to some of the articles that I put up either last week or the week before, and some of you just hating Peter Jarvis and Josie Gregory, particularly for the way in which they write. I'm just bracing you for Nude coming up. I think his writing is more uh, directly communicative than theirs. I think it's more transparent than theirs, but there is something a little stilted about it. And I just wanted to share his model because at the moment I think this is one of the most elaborated models we have available to us of somebody trying to say, well, what is the whole field of learning? What are the different elements that are contained in this field of learning that we need to hold together and pay attention to? Obviously, this isn't the same as saying what is the field of teaching, but we're going to start with the field of learning and then think about, well, teaching is surely something about how do we operate within this field in such a way as we enable other people to learn as best as possible. And Illuris talks about a tension field of learning, which you'll see in his article. Now, again, what I'm about to say is really my take on what he's writing, but I'm going to give you what he's written directly, so you can see what your take is on it as well. But in my take on it, what he begins with suggesting is that there are two different dimensions to learning, which he then physically turns into two different axes. And the first dimension of learning is that learning always involves some kind of interaction between an individual and the environment in which they find themselves. And he suggests that actually this is an evolutionary or biological basis to learning. We as creatures we learn through interacting with the environment around us, and those interactions, which lead to increased capacity or increased understanding, really are what constitutes learning. It's this is a very Piagetian view. We've looked at this when we looked at Piaget together. So you have this interaction between the individual and the environment. This means as teachers, of course, we need to be able to pay attention both to the individuals in our classroom and the whole environment that we're creating. And there's been various points on the PGCert, both in Module 1 and in Module 2, where we've looked at ideas relating to that. So, for example, looking at ideas relating to the individual, we've looked at things like learning styles and learning preferences. Skeptical as I am about some of those things, they're some of the best ideas that we have out there about how individuals learn in different ways. Some of the ideas coming from Kolb and Honey Mumford, for example. And then we've also looked at the idea of how we create a positive learning environment. And we looked at, for example, people like Stephen Brookfield talking about the need to balance authority and ally. And we've looked at John Heron and facilitation skills, talking about, what are some of the things that the group needs in order for the group to work effectively. So we've begun to look at some of the process skills there. Okay, so that's some things about the interaction between the individual and the environment. His other axis is what he calls the acquisition axis, and that suggests that at the one end of that there's the content, there's the knowledge, the skills, the understanding we want the students to acquire. And you'll see when you read Illyrus, he thinks about that very broadly. He thinks about that way more broadly than this just being about acquiring facts or processes to use, which I think he's absolutely right on that. And at the other end, we think about the incentive. So what is it that's going to incentivize the individual to acquire this content? They've had the interaction, and of course, as Illyrus points out, both of these things go on simultaneously. They've had the interaction, but just the very fact of the interaction itself doesn't necessarily lead to acquisition of learning taking place. You know how it is. You can set up the best, most interactive, interesting lesson in the world. You can design fantastic blog tasks. People won't necessarily engage with them. So just because you've got really positive interaction doesn't mean to say that acquisition is going to work well. I think positive interaction is the necessary but insufficient condition for acquisition to take place. Okay, so then he just turns this into a little model where he suggests there's a whole field. So as a teacher, we need to be able to operate right across this triangle. We need to be able to use all domains of this triangle, whilst remembering that the work that we're doing as teachers is rooted in a particular kind of social context. And actually, in most of the groups I've worked with, we've talked about that at various points, because we've talked about, for example, the context of BIM and the way in which BIM is structured and organised, and the way in which that enables certain kinds of teaching practices and actually makes other kinds of teaching practices, which we might be very wedded to, impossible or dysfunctional. And then outside of that, you can look at the way in which higher education is now moving in the UK and in the Western industrialised world in general, the monetisation of education, yada yada yada. Very interesting. You can look at the latest government white paper on education. There's a whole section in there on teacher training. It makes for massively depressing reading, because they say teachers should be trained in two things and two things only: subject knowledge and the ability to control and discipline their classrooms. Well, to me, that's going to make for a very one-dimensional view of teaching, rather than the multi-dimensional view that we've been trying to work with. And of course, in fairness, most teacher training programs do focus purely on those two dimensions, which I think explains quite a lot about the rather poor standard of teaching that I generally see in most schools that I go into. So I think what we've been trying to do on the PG Cert is actually considerably more difficult, but also considerably more real and more worthwhile. He then unpacks this field of learning further and starts talking about content as being about knowledge, understanding and skills at the very least, incentive being about the student's motivation, but also taking real account of the emotions running in the room. When fear gets in the way, or when somebody has a legacy of shame and humiliation around their education, or where they think it's not okay to make a mistake. And again, we've talked about some of these things. And volition, which we've actually called conation, or the conative dimension in other times that we've met, which is just the willingness, not just the willingness to engage with doing the work, but I think more the willingness to engage with when it's difficult. This is the Entwistle stuff we looked at recently around student dispositions towards learning. And again, I think one of the things that's very overlooked in education generally is the understanding that volition, willingness to engage, willingness to embrace the difficulty, willingness to get things wrong and struggle for a bit, because actually that's part of learning. These are dispositions or orientations that can be taught and developed. To ignore those, I think, is the equivalent of saying, well, some students have high IQ, some students have low IQ. That's how it is. It's just a cop out on the part of teachers. I think the intelligence issue has now been firmly booted to touch. There's very few people who think that how well a student does is purely a function of their IQ, and it's evidently clear that that's not true anyway. But I think there's lots more people who haven't yet addressed the issue of volition and conation, and the understanding that a teacher is by no means responsible for a student's willingness to engage with the difficulty. But by the same token, we do have responsibility for pointing students towards that issue and giving them some skills to help develop in that area. And then in the interaction at the bottom, we've got the action that's going on in each lesson. We've got the ways in which communication is working, and we've got the idea of cooperation in the room. And again, we've talked quite a lot about that. So I think, hopefully, you would see that the PGCert has, at different points, worked in each of those three corners. We've talked a lot about all of the issues that come up there. And then he labels those corners and suggests that, starting at the top left, the content is about developing our sense of meaning of what's going on, developing our abilities, but ultimately for him this is about functionality. It enables you to function better in the world in which you find yourself, and that's the point of acquiring content in that broadest sense. It helps you function more effectively in the world in which you find yourself. The incentive part for him is something around dealing with sensitivity in the room. We all want to be in balance. That balance needs to be both mental and physical, and it's about ensuring that we enable students to have a strong enough sense of centre, a strong enough sense of balance, so they can cope with the things that inevitably are going to throw them off as the course progresses. You can deal with being thrown off if your balance and your centre is strong enough. And part of what we need to do as teachers is create a sense of safety and balance in our classrooms that are going to enable students to deal with those different challenges. Whilst remembering, of course, that they're going to come into our classrooms with a whole load of legacies of having been taught in very unsafe places, and they're not just going to immediately believe that what we're doing with them is safe and is designed to help. And then at the bottom, in terms of integration, he talks about sociality. So the idea that in a way, it's sort of a communities of learning idea or a communities of practice idea. Over time, we're enabling the individuals to work effectively within the social group of whatever it is that they're learning. And then don't worry about the theorists for a minute. We'll come back to this in a minute. He then labels these three axes and says, well, okay, in terms of the sorts of different disciplines that would help us connect the corners, in terms of linking up the content and then people's incentive for acquiring that content, we're in the realms of developmental psychology. In terms of thinking about how people are interacting with the content, we're in the realms of activity theory. And in terms of thinking about what's going to incentivize people to interact with other people, then we're in the realms of socialization theory. Okay, so Lewis is setting out there, and I'll give you a couple of things to read. What I think is at the moment the best attempt, and I have issue with various elements of it, but I do think it's the best contemporary attempt at just giving a general overview of the field of learning, and the idea that this is a field we need to be able to occupy in all places and hold some of the tensions of that together. One of the reasons for that, of course, is that he talks about different kinds of learning, which you'll read. Assimilative learning, which is what most people focus on, is just the bit where you're just acquiring more and more information, more and more facts, more and more skill, more and more knowledge, and just adding it to what you've already got. That's fairly straightforward. It's quite easy to teach when the student is working in an assimilative fashion, because you're just giving them more and more pieces of Lego, and they're building up a bigger house or a bigger car or whatever it is that they've chosen to build. Fine, so far so easy. Again, look at the contemporary government white paper. You can see that's the only view of education that they're looking at. it's one of the reasons, by the way, that they're now saying that they really only want to recruit people who either got firsts or 2-1s in their first degree to be school teachers, because there's this rather naive understanding that, you know, those people will know a lot and they will be able to pass it on to their students. It's really depressing, to me. The sorry, slightly lost the thread of what I was about to say. Hang on. You can tell I've not been well. Back in the room. So when you go beyond assimilative learning, and again this is Piaget, you start then thinking about accommodative learning. Accommodative learning is where what you're being given doesn't actually just add on to what you've already got. It makes you actually really reassess what it is that you already thought to be true, or what it is that you already thought you were able to do. That's a very different form of learning. It's much more challenging. It's much more difficult. And one of the things that Piaget points out is that actually there's always some form of accommodation, always some form of assimilation going on, and these two things exist in a kind of a dialogical tension with each other. So it's really important that we're able to recognise this. But going on from that, and this is something that we're going to be kind of working towards in the final part of the PGCert, is the whole idea of transformative learning. This comes from the work of Jack Meserov and then Bob Keegan. The idea that there are some really profound forms of learning which leads to a much more fundamental transformation of the self. Now, I think in a way that's really what higher education ought to be about. It ought to be about taking young adults, mainly young adults, and giving them an educational experience which is going to lead to a really significant transformation of self. And that's then only possible if we're able to deal with the entirety of this learning field that we've been talking about. Okay, now you've seen this slide before. So my sense of how we try and do this in practical terms, developing teachers, and this is my sense of making meaning of the PGCert. This is how do all the different elements fit together, because I can kind of see that as you're going through the PGCert and you have these intensives and you seem to look at different things each time, that it could feel like a slightly discombobulating experience, and it could feel like, oh, well, you know, we've done a bit of stuff on assessment and now we're doing a bit of stuff on personal development. Well, to me, that's actually about exploring the entirety of the field of learning, right? And this, for me, is how it goes together. So when we're developing as a teacher, and I mean both on the PGCert and I also mean after the PGCert, actually, you know, then clearly there are 4 areas that we need to be paying attention to, and these 4 areas cover the field of learning. So the first is the content part. It's our subject knowledge, understanding and skills, and we need to make sure that those things are constantly up to date. The second thing is that we need to have general knowledge, understanding and skills relating to pedagogy and theories of teaching and learning. So now I would say that in itself for me, and of course it depends which theories you pick out, would deal with both axes, because that's got to deal with the interaction between the individual and the environment, or the individual and the classroom, or the individual and you. So it's got that vertical axis, and it's also got to deal with how students acquire content and their incentive and motivation to do that. Okay, now those things are, yes, you begin with declarative knowledge, but that's got to turn into functioning knowledge. And the way I think in which we improve those is reflection on what's actually happened in our own classroom, and refinement and practice, trying new things out and seeing what happens. So that's where the action research project comes into the PGCert, because part of the point of that isn't just so that you do a deep dive into one particular area of your own practice, valuable as that absolutely is. You also begin to acquire the habit and the skill to do reflective cycles, which actually are about increasing your understanding of what's going on, because you're having to explain to yourself why certain things happened, you're having to theorize to yourself why certain things happened, and then trying new things out, both to improve what's been going on in the classroom and to refine and improve your theories, because you need to understand clearly what's happening in order to be able to improve it in a way which is going to be reliable. Okay, so this requires reflection, refinement and practice. Now something links those two things, and that's subject pedagogy, because subject pedagogy asks the question, okay, what's the best way to teach this particular subject to these particular students? And in a way, the ARP really focuses on that, because the claims that you're going to be making at the end of your ARP are saying, right, what I've learned is these are the most effective ways of dealing with this issue with my particular students. So you're creating local knowledge. You're creating knowledge, as Jean McNiff puts it, you're creating knowledge of your own practice. You're not going to be trying to make some kind of global claim about education, because that wouldn't be appropriate on the basis of the scale of the research you've been able to do. But what you can do is something which I think is absolutely vital, is you're adding to the sum of knowledge by talking about very clearly, okay, this is what happened with my students in my situation. The other way we bridge the subject knowledge and the pedagogical knowledge is looking at the formative assessment of our students. What is it that we can see that they're doing well? What is it that we can regularly see that they're struggling with? Why they're struggling with that could be something to do with our subject knowledge, their prior subject knowledge, that some subject knowledge is actually inherently more difficult or more counterintuitive to acquire than others, or it could be something to do with the way in which they've been taught and the way in which they've interacted with that knowledge. And so again, looking at what's been going on will help us diagnose what it is that we need to work on. So those are three areas that we need to be working on as teachers: our subject knowledge, our ability to teach our specific subject, our subject pedagogy, and locating that in the wider field of pedagogy more generally. But actually, the other thing that we need to have is a whole load of emotional knowledge and process knowledge, the ability to work with individuals, the ability to work with groups, the ability to hold people through a process of learning which is inherently really difficult, the understanding that there are times when the emotions get in the way of the learning, fear gets in the way of the learning, dealing with people's mistakes, dealing with people's questions, dealing with people's willingness to engage, non-willingness to engage, their dispositions to learning, whether or not they become responsible learners. All of that stuff, which I think also then links to our personal skills as a teacher, and this is why we did the inter and intrapersonal work around our ability to listen empathically, to really understand where someone's coming from. Those are the coaching skills, right? And also our own congruence. This is the Brookfield stuff about being an authority and an ally. All of these things become a really key part of creating the conditions in which people are most likely to be able to learn, right? So that then links back to subject pedagogy by making me think about, okay, when is it more appropriate that I'm directive and instructive and I do something like direct instruction? When is it more appropriate that I take a much more facilitative and maybe hands-off approach and give the students much more space? When do I need to hold them tight? When do I need to let them go? How might that change across the course of a year? Thinking about Heron again at this point, all his work on, are your decisions about the group hierarchical or cooperative, or are you letting the group decide for themselves, right? So there's an awful lot in there, but I think we've, the different parts of the PGCert cohere now, because this is where all these things begin to come together. One of the ways in which we can deal with the process stuff, right, and link it to the subject knowledge, is by paying attention to threshold concepts. So threshold concepts are the parts of the course that the students are going to find more difficult and more counterintuitive, and they're the sort of the gateways that students have to step through in order to really acquire a deep level of mastery in the subject. Okay, and stepping through that gateway raises all sorts of resistances and difficulties and emotional barriers with the students. So that's why that links the emotional and process work with the subject knowledge. And then, of course, the other thing that we're thinking about in terms of the pedagogical knowledge is we're paying attention to how the group's developing over time. Groups change over the course of the year, and we need to be able to direct those changes in a positive direction as a teacher. Get the group through the storming phase in Tuckman's model, so that you can get to the point of norming and performing. And also balancing our attention between attention to the whole group and attention to individuals within the group to whatever level that's possible. It's different in a group of 6 from a group of 50. So, to whatever level that's actually possible. So that's all of that kind of circuit. And you remember one of the things that we said when we looked at these concept and dialogue maps, which is what this is you want to make the circuit as integrated as possible. We need some process for our own development, on to the right. Really, that's what we're looking at there is the knowledge, understanding, and skills. If we're now stepping back at a meta level of the PGCert, what is the content of the PGCert? Now, when we're thinking about developmental process, we're thinking really about how we interact with each other in the PGCert and what our motivation is in the PGCert. And of course, we know that we use these very standard reflective cycles of planning for something, having really focused practice on it, getting some reflection and feedback, becoming more informed, planning what we're going to do again. It's a very standard ARP kind of approach, but it's the approach that we take in our teaching as well. And this process would help us develop, I think, any of the 4 areas. You can use that same process to help you develop in any of the 4 areas. And of course, we need to know what we need to be focused on for our development. So we have to have an ongoing evaluation of the data we've got in front of us, and that's data relating to results and processes. So the processes might be feedback from students or feedback from peers and feedback from observers. And the results would be, what do we know about progression and achievement data? How well are our students doing? And that then links back to our development cycle, because it helps us decide what it is that we actually need to focus on for our own development. And there are both formal, being observed by college, and informal, being observed by PGCert tutor and having a chat, processes to help us with that. And that, of course, may highlight developmental needs relating to any of the 4 areas. So that's, in my mind, how I try and put everything together. What, in a way, my approach, I think, on the PGCert is to say, let's start by looking at some of the corners, and over time, let's then move towards the centre of this diagram, because as we move towards the centre, that's where we're going to be able to hold the tension of the corners together, hold the tension between students acquiring the content, having the right kinds of interaction, and having the right kinds of approaches and incentives. I think from what you've all been saying recently on the blog, and I find this to be true myself, it's the incentive corner is the one that I think you're finding most challenging. I think we're now at a point where you're all doing really well with designing the right kinds of interactions in your classroom. And occasionally you blog and say, oh, I didn't do it quite as well as I should have done, and I should have made it more interactive, blah, blah. That's fine. If your level of understanding is ahead of your level of practice, even though that can be frustrating, that's a really good place to be in, isn't it? Obviously, because action follows thought. So if our thought and our desire and our intention is still ahead of what it is that we're actually able to do in the classroom, I wouldn't worry about that, because that will unfold for you over the next 3 to 5 years anyway, assuming that you carry on teaching. So that's grand. In terms of your content, yeah, you're all over it. That's absolutely fine. I think it's the incentive corner that most people are struggling with. There were 2 really good blogs a couple of weeks ago on the whole facilitation skills piece. Graham and Tim did really interesting blogs, and actually other people have done as well. So I'm not just kind of like picking those guys out. And one of the frustrations they both shared was they said, "Oh, I'm trying to do all this stuff, around group facilitation and getting the group right." And they both wrote about some things that they've been doing, which clearly really good and really effective things to do, right? And they were saying, oh, but it's still, there's still a long way to go. And I think, well, yeah, I'm not surprised about that. Of course, there's a long way to go, because this, to me, is the most difficult part. And it's the part that I think no one ever pays any attention to, doesn't get paid attention to in teacher training generally. And we all know how difficult it is to get students really engaging with things. And you know yourself how difficult it is. People's engagement in the PGCert, let's be honest, comes and goes. And, by and large, actually, I think it's great and I'm really impressed. But it's not consistent for everyone, because life gets in the way. And again, that's absolutely fine. So if you have a look at some of the names on this map, and you can reverse engineer this map, by the way, if there are certain areas of education that you find yourself really interested in, you can now use this to kind of find some significant educational thinkers whose work might be located in that sort of area. I actually disagree with Illyris on where he's put some of these theorists, but that aside, that's absolutely fine. So in terms of how do people really engage with the content, up in that kind of top left-hand corner, he's put Piaget and Kolb, and I think that's right, because well, you can read all of this in Illyris. But Kolb, for example, one of the ways in which he's criticised is people say, oh yeah, but the Kolb cycle's all well and good, but it doesn't pay any attention to the social dimensions, it doesn't pay any attention to the emotional dimensions, and it kind of assumes that everyone's going to go around the cycle in pretty much the same sort of a way. So you can see he's really interested in how people engage with the content. In terms of people's incentive to learn and volition to learn, we've looked at some of the work of Richard Rogers, and we've looked at some of the Carl Rogers. Sorry, Richard Rogers is an architect. Some of the work of Carl Rogers, and we've looked at the work of John Heron, which are all about how people acquire the incentive to learn and to grow and to develop. And then down towards the bottom, We've looked at Jean Lave a little bit. We've looked at Bruner a little bit. We can look at Bourdieu if you want, but actually, when you get down to that really hardcore bit at the bottom, which is just about interaction, um, what you're finding down there are sociological theorists who aren't directly so much related to education. So I haven't taken you right down to the bottom of the triangle because I didn't think it was necessarily appropriate. What you'll find in the middle of the triangle, however, is clearly where we're going now towards the end of the PG Cert, right? So starting sort of topish, leftish, um, Jack Meserov is the guy who's done all the work on transformational learning. We're going to be looking at him. Stephen Brookfield, we've already looked at somewhat. We could well come back to him if you want to. I would recommend. There's a couple of his books on the PG Cert bibliography that I recommend really highly. There's the one on trust, technique, and responsiveness, being a skillful teacher. That's really good. And the one about teaching for critical thinking. If you're teaching something where you want your students to think better, then that's a really good source to go to. Particularly relevant for the more academic modules that we teach at BIM. We've looked at Schoen and the idea of the reflective practitioner, and you've done some reading of Schoen earlier on in the course. And then if you go right into the very centre, as you know, I'm a big fan of Bob Keegan. I'm unashamedly a big fan of Bob Keegan. We're going to be looking at some of his work next time we meet, because to me that's not sort of like the summit or the truth or anything, but it's an attempt to hold content, incentive, and interaction together in a way that we can then pay attention to all of those different things. Peter Jarvis is working in that kind of area as well, albeit that many of you hated reading him. He's there. Etienne Wenger, all that stuff about working in a community of practice, and the idea about being in a community together as we're trying to deal with the content, we're trying to incentivize each other, and we're trying to have really positive interactions. So that's just me talking through some of the ways in which I think the PG Cert coheres um, and enables us to visit different areas of the field of learning and then start thinking about how we might hold them together, start thinking about which we find most difficult and most problematic for whatever reasons. But what I'd be really interested in this week is just hearing a little bit from everyone on the blog about, okay, for you, how are you now beginning to make sense of the PG Cert in relationship to your own practice? And how are you taking the different elements and making meaning of them and constructing them into your own mental model? Because ultimately, of course, that's what it's about. And there's no one right way of doing that. Um, and we work with, well, we come from different backgrounds, which will affect how we put things together anyway. But we work with different kinds of students at different levels and different sizes of groups, and the beginning of your teaching, that can have a real impact on the kinds of approaches you begin to take, which in itself is worth thinking about, because over time you'll start working with different sized groups and maybe students at different levels, and you will need to think about how you would need to adapt your approaches for those students. But for me, trying to hold all of this field together, trying to be attentive to the needs of individuals, the needs of the group, the ways in which those things interact, how I'm trying to help people acquire content, and how I'm trying to work with the motivations that people have. That whole tension is the way in which I try to think about the PG Cert. And what I'm going to move on to with you, particularly when we look at the work of Robert Keegan, is to start to suggest that actually you can see, in terms of answering those questions of how I hold those things together, there are certain predictable, regularly occurring patterns of behaviour and thought that you see with undergraduate students, and there is a particular kind of journey that I think it's most effective to take them on, so that in working with all those different domains, they become more effective as learners, and acquire more knowledge and become more functional over time. Anyway, quite enough of me, and I hope you found that of interest.